It's always an unenviable task to follow Julianne Cromit. Was that not amazing? Amazing. Thank you. Well, I just have to give you a little warning. She talked about having 11 bits of data coming at you at any given moment. We're going to amp that up to about 13 million in the next 30, 35, 40 minutes. So buckle up. We often move fast. As you all know, the conversation around inclusion in the entertainment industry has really reached a fever pitch. But oftentimes that conversation is really about live action. Let's think about this. The Directors Guild puts out a report every year talking about the percentage of directors that are working in episodic live action series. The Writers Guild puts out a report that I don't believe that animation is considered in. And the Producers Guild, well, they don't put out a report every year in the United States, so we're not sure how producers are doing in the industry. And so
we know.
We know, right, in which we will share with you today. We do interrupt each other, so we need a no interruption rule that Glenn has, but that might happen up here as we've worked together a very long time. We thought it was really important when WIA came to us and asked us if we'd be interested in doing a large-scale analysis of inclusion in animation. We enthusiastically said yes, and there are 3 people that we really have to acknowledge in the room today that helped tremendously, not only partnering with women in animation, but personally were resources to us. And of course, one of those individuals was Julianne Cromit, but also Tracy Campbell and Marge Dean for their incredible effort. So please join me in thanking them. 2 other people deserve recognition. We actually had an animation whisperer at our disposal, and that was Bonnie Arnold, who's also in the room, that helped us tremendously with this effort. And because of the generous support of women in animation, we actually had a junior fellow on that project who flew from Los Angeles to be here today, and that's Hannah Clark, who helped tremendously. So our goal really today with unveiling this comprehensive overview of inclusion in animation, and this is probably our most comprehensive report that we've actually done today. It's actually our 45th report on inclusion, and I think as a team, we're quite proud of the ecosystem approach that we've taken to really illuminate how women and women of color in particular are doing in very varied facets of the animation industry. So we had one overarching question that we wanted to answer when it came to this investigation. And that question was this very simple query. How inclusive is the animation industry when it comes to access and opportunity for women? This very small question was put before us, and to answer it, we actually conducted 7 different investigations. We looked across film and television, who's working above the line in animation, who's as directors, producers, actors, who's working below the line, 9 different unit heads or positions in film, 5 unit heads in television, and then how are the executive ranks performing when it comes to inclusion across 11 different production companies or studios directly involved with animation and 14 different television-based companies. In addition to this quantitative work, which I'll be covering, we also did a series of qualitative investigations where we interviewed 38 women who are in their early career in the animation space and asked them about the barriers and opportunities in animation. We talked to men and women who are executives and asked them very similar questions. And then with the support of the Animation Guild, we surveyed over 250 individuals or members of the Guild. I'll cover the quantitative portion of the study. Kate will cover the qualitative portion. We like to split it up because it helps to focus as we change back and forth on the information. I also have to warn you, Kate is nicer and funnier, as Julianne said, so be prepared for that. I usually get to deliver the bad news, and today we are living up to that. Please feel free to tweet out the slides and the study. We want to garner as much interest and social media attention to the research as possible. And it's a good way to let folks know where the animation industry is doing well and where there's always room for improvement. So to answer our first question, how inclusive is the animation industry, we start by looking at who's on screen. And if you just take a look at how females are doing on screen in animation, if you look across 120 of the most popular films from 2007 to 2018, or the 100 animated television series, the first episode or segment, you see that we're far away from a 50% goal. Females are 50% of the box office, 50% of the population, and well over half of the viewing audience on television. There are only 17% of the leads or co-leads in the 120 top animated films. There are only 3% of those films feature a woman of color driving the action. Moana, Princess and the Frog, and then, of course, one of the Blue Smurfs was voiced by an individual from an underrepresented racial ethnic group. You see that television is doing a bit better here when it comes to on-screen representation. 39% of all speaking characters that were credited were female, girls and women on screen, and we see a higher proportion, 12%, of non-Caucasian girls and women being credited in those storylines. When we move from on-screen to who's calling the shots, it starts to explain why we might see fewer women actually on the small or large screen. When we take a look at how female directors are doing in animation, it's actually quite rare to see a woman calling the shots in the director's chair. When we look to film, only 3% of all film directors were women. That's 5 jobs, 5 opportunities. It's actually only 4 because Jennifer Nelson got to work twice. And there are only 13% of the first episode or first segment across 100 of the top animated series. Only 13% feature a female director. Only 2% of those are women of color. And what's interesting, all of the women of color across film and television were of Asian descent. So we're not even seeing representation behind the camera across different racial or ethnic groups or multiracial or biracial storytellers behind the scenes. Now, it's always a fun day when I get to share positive news, and so it's really nice that I get to say something positive for once. And so this was one of our most pronounced findings. And this is something that I think is really important as we continue our conversations throughout the day and we think about belonging. And Kate will talk more about belonging in a moment. Belonging is really you fit in and your work is validated, kind of a shortcut to Julianne's definition. And we see something happening in the producerial ranks. We looked at produced by credits. Capital P producers in live action and animation. And we found that in animated films over the last, from 2007 to 2018, 37% of all producers were women. 37%. Actually, that statistic is completely unheard of because only 15% of producers in live action were women. So we're actually seeing animation lead for the first time in a very pronounced way over 12 years, 13 years of content. Now, I want to point out something that's really important here when we were talking about bias earlier. You see in live action, it's the yellow bars, you see a flat line. There's really no change, which suggests that implicit and explicit biases are operating in terms of who's getting opportunities to produce in live action films. But in animation, you actually see a curvilinear trend. You see increases followed by decreases followed by increases, which is really important because it illuminates that women are getting access and opportunity because this is typically the pattern you should see when there is less bias involved in decision making. There's one other really important point to this slide. The lows for animation, 12%, 22%, 26%, 31%, they're increasing over time. So what's going on in organizations when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and belonging? Something is working really well to ensure that women are in these positions. And Kate's going to talk about one of the reasons why, particularly from an unconscious bias perspective, this might be happening and how we might need to course correct, not only within the producerial ranks, but how this affects the executive ranks and directing as well. One last point, very few women are getting the women of color are getting the opportunity to produce, whether it's in live action or in the animation spaces. And given the changes, particularly in the US, regarding Gen Z, the most diverse workforce that we've seen thus far, these patterns are very behind when it comes to thinking who's in decision making and can affect the product of a feature film or a television show. Now, when we think about television, we see that producers aren't doing quite as well. 17 to 20% of executive producers, co-executive producers, or created, developed by credits are held by women, very few women of color. And we see them at the producerial level again, but not the top decision-making capacity or role. And so there's room in television, again, to really think, how do you strategize and thrust women into those positions? What are the barriers that they're facing, which Kate will address in just a few minutes, to get them into those more prestigious positions. Now, as we move from directing and producing, it becomes important to also think about below the line. And so looking at the last 5 years of animated content, or the top 52 films, we see that there's very few women in film that are getting the opportunities as unit heads or in key roles behind the camera. It ranges anywhere from 2%, the head of layout, all the way up to 21%, the head of lighting. And so there's a real, I think, opportunity here to think critically about where women are falling out in the pipeline, which we'll illuminate in just a few minutes. More problematically, we see women of color in multiple positions not filling any of the key roles, or only between 3 and 6% of all of these unit head or department head positions working below the line. Now, interestingly, television is a bit better below the line. And we see here a range from 11% as a low, lead storyboard artists, all the way up to story editors, which are about 28% of those key positions. Again, women of color, anywhere from 1% to 13%. So if we really think about a target goal of about 50%, whether it's directing, producing, below the line in film or below the line in television, we see a real disconnect between population norms, audience norms, and hiring practices in film and television. Now, another interesting area to think about is who's at the pinnacle of power. And this is literally the most exciting slide, I think, in my career that I ever I was shocked, and I would swear if this wasn't live streamed, from what I understand it is, so I won't use profanity. But this I've never seen before, and it gets back to this point of there is something happening in animation. There's inclusion and belonging, and for different reasons, we might see these numbers, a variety of reasons, but we have never seen this before, and I want you to focus specifically on the column from film. We took a look at all of the executive ranks across 11 companies in film, 14 companies in television, and we ranked the executives from presidents, chief creative officers, and chief executive officers, all the way to the VP level and in the director level, but the director level isn't on this slide. And what you can see in film is that for the first time, 50% of the most prestigious positions running this particular portion of the entertainment industry are filled with women. Animation, good job. Now, there's a very common pattern that we see. It's typically when power increases, females' participation decreases. And you can see that from the VP level all the way up to the top level in television. But you see 50% of all senior vice presidents being held by women in film, and over 68% of vice presidents and heads being women in film. So there's a very strong pipeline in a particular medium that has often been resistant to putting women in these executive ranks. Now, where there's room for vast improvement is in the television lane, but also for putting women of color into these positions. Only out of the 23 women of color who are executives across both film and television, all but 2 were at the SVP level or below. So a lot of these numbers really pertain to Caucasian women, again, not reflecting the reality of the audience and consumers, and so room for much improvement. Now, as we move from the executive ranks, we need to start thinking about the pipeline. And we're going to think about the pipeline in a couple of ways. The first, I don't have a slide, but I want to present the information. One of the things that we did that was really important, we wanted to know what was going on in animation programs in the United States. So we surveyed the top 6 animation programs, USC, UCLA, Ringling, SVA, Rhode Island, and CalArts. We asked them for their data on animation programs, and every institution gave it to us. Fully half or more of all enrolled or intending students over the last 3 years, from 2016 to 2018, half or more were women. And in particular, in 2016, 65% of all those enrolled or attending, 65% were women in 2016, and in 2018, it was 69%. So there is a very strong pipeline coming out of the institutions that are training individuals to come into the animation space. Secondly, we looked at the proportion of women submitting and having their animated short films played at the top film festivals in the United States. We looked at Sundance, South by, Telluride, Tribeca, and the New York Film Festival. Sure enough, women are submitting short films in increasing numbers. Overall, 47% across all 3 years of the animated shorts submitted and accepted had a female director attached. And what you can see over the last 3 years is a linear increase of 33% in 2016 to 60% of animated shorts had a female director attached in 2018. So the pipeline is actually very strong. And so when we compare the pipeline to what's going on in the different tracks, whether it's directing or producing, it makes us start to wonder where women are actually dropping off. And my last slide really illuminates, we're moving from about 2/3 in the animated program space in schools, about half of all shorts that are animated have a female director attached. And then the pipeline for directing in features really illuminates. We have 3% directors across 120 animated features from 2007 to 2018. Only 7 to 9% of the key roles or unit heads leading to directing. We've lost the women. They're not in the unit head positions. They're not having access and opportunity. And if you look at storyboard, the story department, and animation, we see that we're down to less than 1/5 in these particular gatekeeping positions or the path to directing in features. So overall, in summing up all this information, we see strong producing numbers, particularly in film, producing in television, strong executive ranks data in film, with work to be done for women of color and in the television ranks, but directing, on screen, and below the line, there's much work to be done, and it seems as if inclusion and belonging are a real problem for retention, access, and opportunity for women in this particular space. So we asked our second major question: what explains the lack of women in the animation industry? And to answer this small query, I will turn it over to Dr. Pieper.
Who's apparently going to also provide a comedy routine.
Right,
Who knew?
exactly.
Who knew that was part of the morning? Right, so we were interested not just in the numbers, but to understand why we see fewer women in certain roles throughout the animation industry. And so we conducted a qualitative analysis. We love to count, we love to amass the numbers, but we also love to talk to people and find out what's happening, what their experiences are, and where they see bias in the industry. And so as you heard, we had three main components to this qualitative analysis. We conducted in-depth interviews with 38 women in their early career. Their average age was 29, and about a third of them were from underrepresented racial or ethnic groups. We additionally talked to 37 decision makers. 30% of them were men. About 20% were underrepresented. Their average age was 50, so a good cross-section of decision makers in the industry. And then in partnership with the Animation Guild, we conducted a survey of over 250 individuals. Almost half of them were men. About a third of them, again, were underrepresented. And their average age was around 43. So we actually had the opportunity to hear from a lot of different voices working in animation about some of the things that are happening in the industry and where they see issues for women in moving up in career paths. And what we did was we asked three main questions that we'll talk about. We gave people data. It was really important to us that we ground the questions that we asked in the actual statistics. So we told them how many directors had worked over the last 12 years, and we said, why are there so few female directors? And then we listened to what they had to say. We asked them, we gave them data, and we said, comparatively, why are there so many more female producers than directors? And then we asked, with data from the Animation Guild, on why there's a lack of gender parity in the animation industry more broadly. And so across these three questions, a few different themes emerged that we'll talk through today, and they really provide a picture of what limits the participation of women in the animation industry. And because we're educators, we're going to do a little teaching. So that's exciting for all of you. Hopefully you'll learn something. So the first major theme that emerged is this idea that women are hampered by homophily. And so we like to use the research-based terms, but this is, homophily really just means what Julianne told you about before, which is this like-me bias, the tendency for people to form relationships with those who are alike on some salient characteristics. So whether it's gender or race or the place where you went to university, those might be characteristics that people use to form relationships. We like people who are like us. And when we asked about directors, people told us that there's a masculine culture in animation. And it was important to us to talk about this, not with the term that people typically use, which is the idea of the boys' club, right? But to talk about the social biases and the processes that actually limit women's participation, rather than just to defer to the idea that, it's a boys' club, who knows what that means. And what they told us was that when we asked about directors, about half of the women that we talked to, about a third of the decision makers, and about a quarter of the guild members said that there's a male-dominated culture that's perpetuated in animation and that prevents women from working in leadership. When we asked more broadly about employment generally, we heard the same thing from a little over a third of the early career women, about 20% of the decision makers, and about a third of the guild members. And as an example, we heard that men in charge give jobs to people they feel comfortable with, typically other men, and they don't see women as capable leaders. And so this was really evocative to us of this male preference and culture that exists in animation. And the reason that this is so important is when we start to think about belonging, we know that stereotypical environments, right, environments in which people don't feel a sense of belonging, can reduce interest and perceptions in the career itself. So if women walk into a space where they feel that they don't see women who are like them, where they experience stereotypical role models or a lack of what's called ambient belonging, it can reduce the perception that they're even interested in going into the field or that they'll be successful. And so you'll see attrition as a result. We also know that greater attention to environmental cues are paid by women when they anticipate feeling what's called a social identity threat. So in one experiment, when they told women they were about to interact with a sexist man, they devoted more attention to looking for those environmental cues than to the task that they were supposed to do. And so this is really important because if you think about what people are supposed to do at their jobs, it's their job. Right? You want them to show up and do the tasks that are assigned or given to them, not to be scanning the environment for potential cues that they might be under some sort of social identity threat. So the work product can actually be affected by the environments where people work. And so one thing that we also heard in this description across all three of the samples was that the historical legacy of the animation industry plays a role in the culture that exists today. They talked about the ink and paint model, the 9 old men, right? And that's important, but again, we want to make sure that people are comparing with what's happening now in the present and looking at the progress that needs to be made from here forward rather than looking back. And it's possible that the male-skewed environments actually create feelings of the lack of belonging in women. About 18% of the women we talked to said that the male-dominated culture that they were in actually created a personal barrier for their careers. The second thing that we found is that women are viewed as less valuable. So when we asked about directors, we heard that the way that women are perceived, they're perceived to lack experience, they're perceived as risky, they're perceived as less competent in the directing role. And we heard this from about 1/3 of early career women, over half of the decision makers we talked to, and about 1/4 of the guild members. And we said, they told us that that women don't move into these directing roles because people feel that they're a risk, and that what makes people feel comfortable is sort of deferring to what's come before. And we found this really interesting because we also heard quite a few stereotypes about what it means to be a director, words that align with more masculine characteristics. So you have to be a visionary, you have to be commanding, right? You have to be tough. And we heard this from about 20% across the board of people in different categories that we talked to. And what was really interesting about this use of stereotypes is what happened when we asked about producers. And when we asked about producers, we also heard about stereotypes. But here, all those stereotypically feminine traits were perceived to be an asset for producing. So over half of the people we talked to said that because women are organized and collaborative and supportive, they were good producers. We also heard some pretty condescending terms, that being more secretarial, administrative, that they were caretakers and helpmates, and it was like parenting to be a producer, which we found really interesting because, you know, we go to work every day and it's nothing like parenting, even though there's quite a few administrative tasks we have to do. Not parenting at all. And so here is where we find really interesting about this is it aligns with a large body of research on leadership traits and what prevents women from ascending into leadership roles. And what these two categories for directors and producers show us is that there's a real lack of fit between the idea of being a director and the idea of being a woman. And this, again, like I said, lines up with decades of research about leadership biases. And when we think about leaders, we tend to think about traits of leadership that align with masculine attributes, not so much with feminine attributes. And so to promote women into leadership roles like directing can feel risky because we perceive women as lacking the very traits that we assign to leadership roles. We also know that women can be punished when they ascend to leadership roles and they exhibit masculine traits. So evidence suggests that when we actually hire women into leadership roles, the hiring criteria can shift. So when women show up and they tend to act in a more masculine manner, or they exhibit what we call agentic traits in leadership, more weight is given to their social skills in a hiring situation. We also know that women are less likable. They're seen as less likable when there's no information given about the stereotypically feminine attributes that they possess. And that when clear information is given about women's competence on a male-type task, women are seen as less likable. And so we call that, don't be too good at your job, right? It's a real problem. And so, however, when the information about women's competence is ambiguous, they're much more liked, but they're not seen at all as competent. It's a problem. So in other words, gender stereotypes can dictate how we evaluate women in positions of leadership. And this is where the producing information gets really interesting, because somehow, in a strange, what Stacy has called twist of fate, this producing path has produced 6 of the 7 top female executives now running the animation companies that Stacy talked about in this slide. So apparently, all those administrative roles can put you right into that track of running a major company. So all the skills that are devalued in directing apparently translate very well to running massive corporations. Who knew? So what's curious to us then is why the traits that make for excellent producers and excellent executives, which is really typically defined in masculine terms, why those don't translate into directing. We also heard that in more general employment, there's a culture issue for women. They don't feel validated in the roles that they have. They feel that they're treated as inferior, that they're interrupted, demeaned, that they don't feel like their work is valued, and that there's just few opportunities for women. And this is really important because, as Stacy mentioned, when we think about belonging, this concept of fit, right, what role are you in, and does it fit with who you are, and the concept of validation, are you valued for the work that you're performing, really align to create that sense of belonging. The third category that we heard from people is that maybe women just aren't interested interacting. It's possible, right? Maybe they just don't want to do this. And so cutting across directors in employment, so these are numbers for directors, about a quarter of the women that we talked to, over a third of decision makers, and a fifth of the guild members said perhaps women just aren't interested, or they're not supported from a very young age, or there's no opportunities that they get to even be directors. And we heard the same thing when we asked about more general employment. Again, around the same percentage of people said, well, maybe women just don't want to work in animation. Maybe they want to do pottery or painting or other forms of art and self-expression. Maybe that's what's happening. And we said, maybe. It doesn't seem likely if they're going to animation school. Go to animation school to be a painter. I mean, you could. So what prevents women from disclosing, right? There's a few different things from research that we know. We know that women anticipate or experience backlash when they self-promote. Mm-hmm. We know that stereotypical environments, as we talked about before, can reduce women's interest or perceived success. We know that under conditions of stereotype threat, so the fear of confirming a negative stereotype about your group, that women might choose to go in and elect to announce ambitions into a more gender stereotypical career path. And we know that when individuals see tokenistic hiring practices where only a few people from their group make it to the top of an organization, they're less likely to apply. So there's a lot of reasons that women might not disclose what they want to do. However, there's also a great way to figure out what women want to do. It's to ask them. And so we did. And 90% of the early career women that we talked to said that they do, in fact, aspire to leadership roles. Who knew? 40% of them or so, they want to be showrunners. 35% say that they want to direct. 35% want to be an art director. 18% say they want to be executives. And we heard about a variety of other key roles: production design, layout, so many other things that people want to work in. And they understand that it's a career path to get there. So we also heard that there's comparatively more women working as producers because there's a career path available. And so one thing that's important to us is where we see a lack of pipeline for female directors is to think about where we do see a pipeline for female producers and how women might be tracked into that path early in their career, either because of the way that they disclose their ambitions or perceptions that other people have. The last section that we wanted to talk about is particularly what women of color experience in the animation industry. We saw the low numbers, and we wanted to know what was happening. So we asked the early career women who identify as women of color about their experiences in the animation industry. 2/3 of them said that they're tokenized, or they're the only one in their company or their work group. They feel isolated, that they have to work harder, or their contributions are minimized. About half of them said that who they are might be seen as an asset or is more trendy right now, but that the industry still is fairly tone deaf when it comes to incorporating what women can do as women of color, being valued not just for who they are in terms of their background, but actually the skills that they have. And so we were also curious not just about what problems exist, but what solutions exist too. Because we know that when we come in to do a research study, you've all been here for 3 years thinking about unconscious bias, inclusion, right? You've been working on these issues in your company, and we were curious what people knew about them. And so we said, what efforts are you aware of, and are they working? And people told us that 3 main things are happening. One, that there's hiring happening. People are being hired into different roles. They know about this. They're aware of it, which is great, because part of the solution to this is hiring. They know about events that are taking place, panels, mixers, opportunities to learn about the problem and the solutions to inclusion. And the companies are taking certain actions, whether it's forming affinity groups or putting policies into place, that all of these things are shaping the industry as it moves forward. Most people say that these are working, that these efforts are bearing some sort of fruit, but it's very slow, the progress. And then it's not a panacea, that there are definitely a downside to some of the ways that things are happening. We also heard from about 8% of the Animation Guild members that we talked to. They said that hiring standards they felt were being lowered to include more women, which is problematic. We also heard from about 18% some form of backlash, either that men were pushed out or passed over, that the work product had reduced in quality, that experience was losing out to diversity, or that it's creating a rift in the industry. Right, so some pushback on whether inclusion efforts were valuable or important and what that was doing to the culture in different companies. And lest we think that this is just a problem of male perception, about a third of the women that we talked to were skeptical about the efforts that were taking place. And they told us they weren't sure that these were anything more than lip service and that were they substantial efforts to creating change in the industry. So as we heard about solutions, we also got a real sense of the temperature of the industry when it comes to issues of inclusion and belonging, and where there's skepticism and doubt and actually backlash to what's happening. And so what that communicates to us is that inclusion has to be everyone's business. It can't just be for women. It can't just be for people of color. It has to be for everyone. And it has to be about creating cultures of belonging in organizations that make everyone feel a sense of fit and validation. And so in looking across the literature and the ways that you can create belonging, we wanted to offer 3 broad solutions for how to start to think about putting some of these ideas into place. The first is to cultivate belonging for all women, particularly women of color, and to think about creating fit and validation. We know from research in academic institutions that experiencing bias and discrimination can decrease a sense of validation, which is linked to belonging. And so obviously reducing bias and discrimination is crucial for making people feel that their work is valued and that they have a sense of fit in the organizations where they work. Second, to clear the air of stereotypes. So to make sure that people don't experience stereotypical thinking or processes in organizations. For example, women in math, there's this great study. They looked at how when they experienced greater gender stereotypes and more of a sense that learning math was an innate skill that some people were good at, they were less inclined to continue to pursue degrees in calculus. So they felt less of a sense of belonging and less of a goal to persist and carry forward in a career that they were good at and interested in initially. Third, to really communicate what the organization is doing. So research has shown that women who perceive that women ended up perceiving that an organization had greater procedural fairness for women, even when they were aware of diversity programs that were targeted to other groups. So telling people the work that you're doing, making those statements, and letting people know that inclusion is valued, it's important, and you're active in those areas is critical for women to see and anticipate that they will feel and be valued for the work that they do. And lastly, we have to think about how we define group membership and redefine it. And Julianne talked about this a little bit, but when we bring people together, to do so in a way that creates a larger group, a larger sense of who we are as an organization rather than just as individuals, but that the things we do are interdependent, they're cooperative, we all have a unique set of skills and a unique vision for what needs to happen. And when we're together, we're stronger and better. Everyone is part of this. The second thing that's really important, once you bring people into organizations, we want them to move through their career path and feel like they have a way to move forward and to move up into key positions of leadership. And it's critical that to do this, we reduce 2 things, subjectivity and ambiguity, because those are the places where these biases that interfere with decision-making or how we see people or different groups, that's where they thrive.
So even if you create a sense of belonging and you hire people, your efforts will not be successful without reducing subjectivity and ambiguity in how people are retained, promoted, or in otherwise given accolades in their organizational environments.
And this can work in a couple ways. So first, making it clear what types of contributions individuals make to a task, right? So not just a sense of, Stace, you did a really great job on this study, but to say, how did Stacy contribute to the study that we did? Because we know that when women's contributions to a task are not made explicit, they're rated as less competent than their male peers. However, when we make those contributions clear, they're perceived as equally competent, equally influential, and they're seen to have demonstrated leadership on a task. So to this issue of when you evaluate people, if you know exactly what their contributions have been, you can make an accurate evaluation of what they can contribute to the organization going forward. We also have to hold in balance these two ways in which stereotypes creep into our thinking, right, around the ideas of competence and likability, and the expectations that gender role adherence can play in evaluations. So the information that we use to make evaluations and the way that we use stereotypes can actually bias our judgments. We know that stereotypes can affect how we store, organize, and recall information. And so by acting to set up clear criteria at the outset before a decision is made, right, we can actually collect objective assessments of how people are performing, commit to the criteria, and this is really important, commit to the criteria that you're going to use in advance. And research shows that when people say, here's the criteria, we commit to the weight and importance of each of these factors on an evaluation, they're less likely to make biased judgments going forward. The other thing is that we have to make evaluations two things, interdependent and accountable. So evaluators have to feel a sense of self-interest. It matters that my judgments of the people who work for me are accurate, that I'm not making biased judgments. I'm accountable for those assessments. The last thing, I guess I could have shown you these as we were going. The last thing is to make inclusion for everyone, to frame the problem and give people opportunities to learn. So framing the issue of inclusion is not something that the company has to do and everyone has to participate, but inclusion is something that happens because we individually care about this and we move towards it as a group and as an organization. Giving people opportunities to learn about the historical roots of exclusion, the structural ways in which bias is enacted in organizations and in culture. Why do evaluations matter? Why should we do this better? Why are clear criteria important? We also have to provide opportunities for interaction between groups in ways that are structured to reduce anxiety that people might feel about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, right, in these interactions. And lastly, to really evaluate how the pipeline of individuals entering this industry are engaged and the ways that it's being messaged. Because we know two things are happening. We know that Generation Z is coming. There are people who are born in 1995 or later. They're the most diverse generation, and they care deeply about issues of diversity and inclusion. And if they're not present, if inclusion and belonging are not present in organizations, it's going to be a turnoff. So there's a workforce crisis coming. These people who are entering the industry, who are about to walk through your doors, if the organizations that you work for aren't sensitive to these issues, they're going to turn around and walk right back out. The second thing is that we have to hold in balance this message that we're sending to people who are right now don't feel like they're included in organizations. So we know that over time, individuals, particularly men, perceive that anti-male bias is increasing, particularly if they're politically conservative, as we talk about in the US. And so the industry has to reconcile these perceptions, look at the messages that we're sending, particularly to the pipeline, how we're talking about the opportunities that are available to people, and create a sense that this opportunities for inclusion involve everyone. And so we're excited to share these thoughts and the ways that the industry can move forward, because we want to come back in a couple years, because Annecy is great and you all seem like a fantastic audience, and we want to see that things have changed. And so we're offering these as a way to think about moving forward and creating an industry and moving forward as an industry that really values all voices.
And I think I just want to end on, if you can really think through strategically how Women in Animation, WIA, can really be a convening body, because there are two things that you have in your favor. Animation is leading on this issue, and you can really create, I think, a larger industry ecosystem by working not only within animation, but asking live action counterparts to meet the same goals that you've achieved and help share with them the way that they were achieved, and how working towards greater inclusion can bring television up to where film is, and the whole industry can start moving in lockstep together. You have an unprecedented opportunity with WIA at the center to, I really think, create a plan, invite us back in a year or two, and we can celebrate the massive change between now and then, and the accomplishments that have already occurred. Thank you very much. Is there time for questions?
Oh,
okay, great. Who might have a question?
Oh, right in the front. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if I missed something, but why do you think animation is most advanced than the live action world?
Well, I think that's a great question. And one is that we heard from what Kate indicated, that there is a perceived stereotypicality around the producer role that has allowed women to really, I think, excel. I think that there might be more stability in film with animation in terms of work-family issues. And you know, I think that one other issue, and we were talking about this before today's event, back in 2005, what's now called the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media really rolled out, and the focus was on content targeting young people. And I think animation really galvanized around Gina's message very early on and became sensitized to many of these issues. And what's interesting about the producerial information is it really reflects the life cycle of films, right? The gestation of how long it might take to create an animated film, those cycles of increases and the steady increase over time. I think some of the changes in the executive ranks had to do with some of the crises that the industry has faced over the last year and a half. And so it's never one factor, but I think it's a confluence of factors and almost the stability of the animation workforce vis-a-vis live action. A lot of people have to leave because of tax incentives or whatnot to work away from their families, and that's something that animation offers, I think, to some degree, that live action film doesn't.
And I think the other part of that is that animation is set up more organizationally, right? So live action films, you have a cycle of hiring people for 6 to 9 months, or right, it's a lot shorter, and the productions actually form and then disperse, right? But animation happens within an organization, so there's a company structure that lends itself to some of these policies. We couldn't necessarily say to the live action industry to think about subjectivity in how you hire people. Right. You can try, but those hiring periods happen pretty quickly. When you have an organizational structure where you actually put out a job description and interview people for the job, it's a little different.
But that's also animation's strength and why they can lead. Right, there is no job description and posting arena for folks in other spaces of entertainment. And so there's a real ability here from an organizational point of view that other spaces in entertainment could really learn from and adopt. Because if you standardize the way in which people find out about the organization and learn about what's going on, it could be a huge accelerator to a talent pool that is ready and waiting. And live action clearly is in desperate need of doing something vastly different than they have in the past.
Given the statistics on producing in animation, is there an inherent problem with women hiring women?
Well, I think that there's always an inherent problem. We didn't talk about social dominance orientation, where women often defer to the culture, and that culture is often white and male. And if you have a woman who's high on social dominance, just like any other individual characteristics, she may defer to the culture rather than the qualified talent pool, right? She might pick someone that reflects the norms of the culture. And so it's really important to just not hire women in executive positions, but they have to be the right women that care about inclusion and belonging. Or if you have a woman high on social exclusion or social dominance, giving them clear criteria actually reduces the likelihood that they just replicate the current structure, and that criteria can then facilitate inclusivity in their decision making. So there's a way to counter when women don't support, but women are absolutely part of this problem, right? Because if women truly, to Julianne's point, had a like me bias, these numbers would be vastly different. But folks are in a culture that has valued a very different point of view, and women often hold that exact same position.
So given the numbers at the top then, I mean, how can that be addressed in sort of working with those that are in positions that can hire women to try and change that culture?
Right, I think that's a fantastic question, and that's where we get into the need to really think about how we evaluate people, the traits or the criteria that are necessary to bring people into different roles. And one thing that we heard about and we didn't put on the slide is this idea that women get tracked into producing instead of into the roles that lead to directing, right? And so for women at the top to really take a look at what are the tracks that people are following and the low numbers in that pipeline to directing. How do you bring more women into the story department, into the animation departments? Those can be priorities, right? To think about what criteria really makes someone good at storytelling, what makes someone good at animation. Are there objective ways we can evaluate talent? Are there objective ways that we can set criteria for promotions? And we know that in animation, and we've heard this over the last couple of weeks, that months, that there's a culture of sort of waiting in line, waiting for your turn, right? But how do we set this across the industry so everyone knows what's expected, right? To move into these positions, here's what you have to accomplish to do this, and then help these women at the top to think about how to put that throughout the organization. So there's a clear ladder for people to climb and a way for them to move forward into these roles of influence.
Secondly, too, I think those numbers are relatively new, right? So we have to give these women time at the top to really roll out their leadership plan over the next 12, 18, 24 months. And so I don't think that there's been enough time, but I would love to say, okay, this is one point in time. What does their hiring look like moving forward? Because if they're just hiring white men, then the larger community should be holding them accountable for their decision making, because there can't only be white men that are capable, talented. How many? 7 billion people on this planet, and you have 6% of leadership roles going to women in television. That's a lack of really understanding the audience, right? There's a disconnect that shareholders should be crying out for and audience should be crying out for. So I think, it would be great to have all these women come together and really understand that they are in a power position that I don't think we've ever seen before. And how can animation lead, really understanding the biases that they may or may not be aware of, particularly when it comes to subjectivity and ambiguity.
I don't think. Oh, hello. Hi. Great talk. Don't know if we're not talking about this at all, but so I don't want to open a can of worms or anything. But it has the advent of something really big and explosive like the Me Too movement affected your research at all, or is it like not in a biased kind of way, but like has it made the conversation very different? Like lately, or has it been, I don't know, is this affecting how women are getting hired? Is this bringing more women in? Is it pushing more out? Like, what has it affected it at all?
Yes, I think is the short answer to the question. We heard from women when we talked to them about issues, not extensively about the ways in which they'd either seen or heard, or in some cases experienced, whether it was harassment in organizations or just treatment. So I think there's a sensitivity that maybe wasn't there before. And I think really what has happened is that women they feel they have more of a voice to share some of these things, right? So, and that's hugely important. And I think to Stacy's point, building up over the last, decade or so of work, right? Socializing people to the problem that women are not only outnumbered, right, and now increasing to the point where they can say, yes, being outnumbered also means we're treated in some really problematic ways. That has been a huge part of this evolution to get to be on this stage today, right? You don't start out with a study and say, what are the barriers, right? People have to be sensitized to understanding what it might mean for women in organizations to experience this particular, form of treatment. So I think it's been hugely important. We heard about, the ripple effects that, different things have had on the industry and the ways that people are more sensitized to it.
It's interesting, too. We do yearly reports on the industry, and 2018 was the first time that we saw change in the industry. It's the first time across, we look at the top 100 films every year, it's the first time that we saw 40% of the top 100 films were led or co-led by a female. We've never seen that before. 28% were led or co-led by a person of color. We've never seen that before. Women over 45 were on screen, doubled what they were the year before. We have not seen that before. 11% of all films featured a woman of color. Typically it's 3 or 4 per year. Those changes were pre-Time's Up Me Too, like in the pipeline, in the gestation of storytelling. And so what I think we're seeing is people were starting and have changed, and then Me Too and Time's Up accelerated that change. The question is now, in a year, right, because we have to think about the life cycle of television shows and cinematic content, that those numbers will tell us how it's affected hiring. I think on our end, it's given us access to people we might not have had access to pre-Me Too, Time's Up. And that's helped with, I think, rolling out solutions for change. Okay.
Hi. So in your pipeline problems of women actually getting from 18 and 16% from story and animation into the 3% of directors, did you do a study on what becoming a mother does to affect those numbers and how the studios or haven't done anything to support that, like daycare, on-site daycares, cheaper daycare, that kind of stuff?
Well, we typically ask questions about issues pertaining to work-family, or we evaluate if they come up in the responses. And we've been doing this for several years, both in the independent space and now this large-scale study on animation. We actually don't hear this as a barrier that's top of mind for women. If they've made a commitment to be on a particular track, they've made a commitment, whether it's a director, producer, et cetera. However, we know 2 things can solve this problem. Cluster hires, where you bring people in at a particular level all together, and fast tracking to the executive ranks, in addition to some of the things that you mentioned. And so it's curious to us that we don't hear more about that, whether it's flexibility in work schedule or issues of daycare or family leave. But I think the career women that we've spoken with over the years, if they've made that decision, they're going to do it independent, and their life is set up in a way to support that. And it's interesting because people often don't like to hear that answer because there are so many issues within these companies that need to be solved when it comes to these particular issues for men and women. Great.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.